Hello, I'm Stavros Mavrodeas, and the subject of my talk is financialization and Marxism. I'll proceed directly by uploading a PowerPoint that will help us in today's lecture. Everything can say it. Um, as I already said, the subject of my talk is the financialization hypothesis. This is a very popular hypothesis nowadays. Its main point is that it maintains that capitalism has nowadays entered a new stage, a new era, where money capital dominates the total circuit of capital, and thus money capital has dethroned productive capital as the center of the capitalist system. Um, the financialization hypothesis, more ambitious versions actually maintain that money capital becomes totally independent from productive capital uh, because money capital can nowadays exploit directly labor and independently from productive capital. It can exploit directly labor not through surplus value extraction, but through usury. And because of this, the whole structure of the capitalist system changes. Now, the financialization hypothesis is proposed by three currents of economic analysis. First, mainstream economics. There's a very vibrant current of financialization within mainstream economics, particularly new Keynesian ones. Second, from post-Keynesianism. And third, the financialization hypothesis has been proposed by Marxist and Marxism views. Each of these three currents has its own specificities, but it has also common elements with the other currents. Now, this talk focuses on the Marxist and Marxism versions of financialization and argue that financialization is a false term for Marxist analysis for the following reasons. It misrepresents contemporary developments in capitalism, that is, the spectacular ballooning of the financial system during periods of weak profitability and accumulation is not a novel phenomenon. It existed in the past, it exists nowadays, with some specific characteristics, but it is not a novel phenomenon. Thus, it does not constitute a new epoch, let alone a new capitalism. The second problem is that financialization deforms Marxist economic analysis by adopting Keynesian and post-Keynesian arguments, in particular by autonomizing financial profits, interest, in the classical version, from surplus value. It abandons the labor theory of value and its theory of money and exploitation. And third, financialization unwarrantedly rejects the function of fictitious capital in times of prolonged crisis and stagnation. Now, in my opinion, the Marxian concept of fictitious capital is particularly relevant and realistic in understanding how the financial sector is related to real accumulation and how this connection functions in period of crisis. Thus, in the end, I will argue that classical Marxist economic and monetary analysis has a better explanation. The structure of the lecture is the following. First, the financialization hypothesis will be presented. Then, The Marxist and Marxian versions of financialization will be presented. Third, uh, I will try to show how classical Marxism is better able to explain contemporary financial and economic developments than the financialization hypothesis, and the last part will conclude. Now, this talk is based on previous work, and particularly on the two background articles that you can see in the PowerPoint. Now, what is the core of the financialization hypothesis? The financialization hypothesis argues that since the 1990s, the financial system has undergone a series of innovative transformations and thus has become independent from productive capital. First, second, it has conquered capitalism commanding heights, and third, it has transformed the whole capitalist system according to its prerogatives. Financializationists, that is, supporters of the financialization hypothesis, propose four stylized facts as a factual basis for their arguments. The first thing is that there is an increased weight of the financial sector in contemporary advanced capitalist economies. For example, the financial sector's GDP profits, and also some qualitative changes, that is, new complex financial instruments. The second stylized fact is that there is a strong tendency during the recent years, especially after the 2008 crisis, that the corporate sector tends to finance itself through retained earnings and capital markets and shadow banking, and not through the traditional banking channels. The third stylized fact is that firms adopt the principle of shareholders' value maximization, and this is also closely related with the prominence of institutional investors. And the fourth argument is that there is an increased indebtedness of working and middle-class households in several advanced capitalist economies. The combined results for the financializationists always, the combined results of this process are the following. First, productive capital depends totally upon money capital, and thus productive capital transforms itself according to money capital's requirements. And second, the working class depends directly upon money capital, and it is being exploited by money capital through usury, that is, through usurious lending, personal consumption loans, and so on. So for the financializationists, this new finance-dominated capitalism is first completely different from traditional capitalism. That is, it has a different economic structure, different exploitation mechanisms, and different class structure. And second, it is more crisis-prone because of its inherent financial instability. Here, note that for financializationists, crises nowadays are solely financial crises, not having any serious connection with real accumulation and its measures and variables, for example, profitability. In a nutshell, in finance-dominated capitalism, firms seek to maximize shareholders' return in the stock market rather than long-term profit through investment. Firms also finance themselves through retaining earnings, stock market, and shadow banking. And capital markets dominate the financial systems, and banks may have become almost redundant. And finally, consumers depend upon borrowing from the financial system for sustaining their mode of consumption. Consequently, money capital dominates capitalism and is able to extract higher returns than productive capital, as it can exploit both productive capital and the middle and working classes. Now, the financialization hypothesis did not appear out of the blue, meaning that there were several important precursors, progenitors of this hypothesis. Thus, the notion that there was some structural break in capitalism's historical evolution, and after this structural break, the financial system conquered the system's commanding heights, it is an argument that dates back in the beginning of the 20th century and has been voiced by mainstream economics, by Keynes, and also within the Marxist tradition by Hilferding most prominently. In what interests more today's talk, that is the Marxist tradition, Hilferding was the first to suggest that capitalism has evolved to a new era characterized by finance capital. Now, Hilferding's finance capital is a merger of productive and banking capital under the dominance of the latter, that is, under the dominance of banking capital. Notice here that it is not money capital in general, but banking capital. That is a section of money capital. In finance capital, the dominant section are banks, not stock exchange, not capital markets. Hence, banking capital dominates productive capital, contrary to Marx's view. But for Hilferding, surplus value is always extracted by productive capital. Thus, banking capital, in the case of Hilferding's finance capital, has no independent sources of profit. It is dominant, but it does not have an independent source of profit, an independent mechanism of exploiting the working class or some other class. Now, we know nowadays that Hilferding's thesis has several shortcomings. The first is in empirical terms. We know that this case, the finance capital, was an exception. It did not cover the majority of capitalist economies, and especially the Anglo-Saxon one. So it was a special case, not a general case. Second, we know that Hilferding's analysis leads to an abandonment of the Marxist labor theory of value. Now, Hilferding's thesis was relaunched by the Monthly Review School. So Suisse in 1997 mentioned the financialization of accumulation, but without elaborating more. And there was a breakout paper by Krippner in 2005 that coined the term financialization. However, in her first work, Krippner did not consider financialization a new version of capitalism or a new stage. Mainstream economics and post-Keynesianism followed in adopting the notion of financialization. And here I want to stress that contrary to widespread belief that financialization is a radical concept, there is a very strong mainstream financialization literature. Now, let us turn to the Marxist and Marxist versions of financialization. In my opinion, we can discern four versions. The one is proposed by Kostas Lapavitsas, the second by Dick Bryan, the third by the Monthly Review, and the fourth by Ben Fine. In my opinion, the two first have a rather Marxist flavor in the sense that they essentially abandon Marxism and flirt with post-Keynesianism. The two last, remain within the Marxist analytical framework. Now, let us begin with the Lapavitsas version. Lapavitsas adopts financialization directly from post-Keynesianism. His main arguments are the following. The appearance of shadow banking makes typical banking redundant, and the financial system becomes stock exchange based rather than bank-based, bank-centered. Second, the Marxist notion of fictitious capital is redundant as the new financial structures are unrelated to the production sphere and must be analyzed independently. So the labor theory value and its associated monetary theory are essentially discarded. In Lapavitsas' view, finance is the new master of the system. Now, to avoid criticisms of proposing two separate capitalist classes, meaning the financiers on the one hand and the old-type productive capitalists on the other, the industrialists, he argues that finance subsumes and reshapes productive capital according to its prerogatives. So there is no nowadays distinction between money and productive capital. Then he proceeds to argue that finance directly exploits workers through usury. He explicitly says that these practices are reminiscent of the age-old tradition of usury, but they are now performed by the formal financial system. He initially proposed the term financial exploitation in order to characterize this exploitative mechanism. After criticisms, especially by Ben Fine, for confusing capitalist exploitation with the pre-capitalist usury, he renamed this new form, in his opinion, of exploitation as financial expropriation. Now, for Lapavitsas, this new mechanism of exploitation, financial expropriation, that is, boosts finance's profits independently of surplus value and enables it to exploit not only the working class, but also middle bourgeois classes, and also other parts of capital. In his opinion, financialization represents a new stage of capitalism, a new social order. And finally, there is no general theory of crisis. In his opinion, Marxism is wrong on this point. Each crisis is historically specific. Thus, for example, for the case of the 2008 crisis, he argues that it is a financialization crisis unrelated to profitability. Now, Bryan argues similarly that since the early 1990s, finance has become commodified through several financial innovations, securitization, derivatives, etc. This increased leverage on the derivatives, but also increased workers' financial exploitation through usury. According to Bryan, the wage relation and thus labor time, a key variable in Marxist political economy, uses to determine money, and the money subsumes the wage relation within it. This is a reversal of the Marxian and Marxist line of analysis. According to Brian, labor became, after these changes, a form of capital. Again, this is a very radical departure from Marxism. Why it became a form of capital? Because the reproduction of labor is now a source of surplus value transfer in the form of interest payments and the financialization of daily life. Practically meaning that workers take personal loans in order to sustain themselves, and also that social security funds play in the stock exchange. So Brian actually argues that the distinction between capital and labor becomes blurred. So he continues by arguing that exploitation is not confined to unpaid labor time, but extends to usury, and the second mechanism becomes dominant. Finally, since in his opinion labor is a form of capital, this implies directly a new class structure different from that of typical capitalism. Now, the monthly review and the Marxo-Keynesian approaches follow a slightly different course. Although financialization was initiated under monthly reviews auspices as a term, monthly review was a latecomer in adopting it. Second, it adopted financialization in conjunction with the arguments that increasing income inequalities lead to increasing indebtedness of private households, which is a form of covert underconsumption in their opinion, and B, that increased financial leverage and speculation is part of the neoliberal era of deregulation. In this vein, the monthly review school identifies the neoliberal era as a new stage of capitalism, initially branded as neoliberalism, subsequently renamed globalization, and later renamed again as financial globalization. However, the monthly review approach does not argue that financial profit has become independent from surplus value. That is, that there is no independent mechanism of exploiting workers or other classes through usury. Finally, the social structures of accumulation approach follow a similar path with that of the monthly review, adding some more emphasis on institutions. Last, Ben Fine offers a more consistent Marxist view, analyzing financialization through the labor theory of value and its theory of money. He maintains that the growth of finance and the new financial forms of the last 30 years usher in a special phase of neoliberalism, which is a policy, not a stage. In his opinion, financialization occurs when the accumulation of interest-bearing capital in the economy becomes extensive and intensive. Interest-bearing capital becoming intensive means that there is a growth and proliferation of financial assets which become more distant from production. And extensive means that the operation of interest-bearing capital extends to new eras of economic and social life in hybrid forms of capital. Following from this, we find finance acquires a dominant position as regards capital accumulation only in the structured environment of shadow banking. In the context of the latter, exchange can be facilitated by the intermediation and the dominant presence of fictitious capital. So for Fine, the notion of fictitious capital remains valid. In his opinion, finance cannot acquire autonomous channels of exploitation of the working class, and the new forms of operation of money capital are policies used by capital to surpass its contradictions. So he follows the Marxian logic of relating finance to the sphere of production. Financial profit is a part of the surplus value produced in production, in the sphere of production. What is missing from his analysis is how the current emergence of financialization relates to profitability, and this is a rather grave error. Now, in my opinion, the Marxist and the Marxist versions of financialization fail on several counts. First, they adopt, the majority of them, the post-Keynesian theory of endogenous money. This is a problematic theory because it cannot define coherently capital, and also misconceives the relation between interest and profit. The post-Keynesian theory of endogenous money is akin to the old banking school and faces similar problems with that school. The problem is that the Marxist and Marxist versions of financialization, with the exception of Ben Fine, abandon or misunderstand the Marxian notion of fictitious capital. Thus, they easily converge with mainstreamers and post-Keynesians in arguing that the monetary sector dominates the real accumulation sector and has independent sources of profit from the latter. Also, Marxism financialization currents have a weak theory of capitalist crisis. As I already argued, they consider crisis as conjunctural, and they do not propose a general theory of crisis. Tome, in a very interesting paper, has accurately argued that the financialization hypothesis ultimately ascribes to a Keynesian possibility a theory of crisis, which is a very insubstantial theory of crisis. There is another major problem with the Marxism financialization hypothesis currents. They actually end up with a Keynesian and post-Keynesian theory of classes. Clarify this. Keynesians and post-Keynesians propose implicitly or explicitly a three-class structure of capitalism: workers, industrialists, and financiers. The latter are considered as rentiers and as a burden to capitalist accumulation. For them, for the Keynesians and post-Keynesians, a state-regulated capitalism should favor the industrialists at the expense of the financiers and possibly treat workers humanely within the constraints of capitalist accumulation. Profits, interest, and wages are simply different income shares. So, Keynesianism does not have any analytical problem with this, as it argues that other factors affect savings and other factors affect investment. So they have no problem in dichotomizing the capitalist class into two classes, the financiers and the industrialists. Marxism, on the contrary, has an explicit two-class structure of pure capitalism, workers and capitalists. Capitalists are subdivided in fractions, productive money and merchant or commercial capital, but ultimately are unified as a class in total capital. The formation of the general rate of profit is a process unifying the bourgeoisie against the proletariat. So for Marxism, interest and also merchant or commercial profit are parts of surplus value. Surplus value is extracted at the sphere of production by productive capital, and then this is divided between the productive capital's profits, the financial profits, and the merchant or commercial capital profits. So there is only one fundamental exploitation mechanism in capitalism, surplus value extraction. And then the profits that are being generated from surplus value are subdivided between the three main fractions of capital. Now, the next section of which I will turn focuses on how classical Marxism offers a better understanding of capitalism's modus operandi, even nowadays, a better understanding than the financialization hypothesis. I won't delve into the empirical problems of the financialization hypothesis, although there is compelling evidence that real accumulation continues to be the center of capitalism, and that falling profitability a la Marx, that is the law of the falling rate of profit, is at the core of the 2008 crisis, as well as in previous crises. And you can see some indicative references by PowerPoint. Now, in analytical terms, in my opinion, classical Marxism offers a superior to the financialization hypothesis framework for understanding financial phenomena. Classical Marxism maintains that real accumulation remains the center of capitalism, and that the falling profitability observed during the 2000 crisis was the latter's cause. How is classical Marxism proceeds to support this argument? For classical Marxism, the total circuit of capital reveals the modus operandi of various forms of capital in the context of real accumulation and the relationship between monetary and real accumulation. In particular, it highlights the primacy of productive capital, surplus value extraction, and its redistribution among productive money and commercial capital. This is the classical expression of the total circuit of capital, beginning with money capital, providing finance to productive capital engaging in production, and thus extracting surplus value, and then going to commercial capital in order for this new value to be realized. And out of the receipts from the sale of this new augmented mass of value, productive capital pays commercial capital and also pays money capital back. So the three fundamental forms of capital, money capital, productive capital, and commercial capital, function differently but are also entwined in this circuit. The sphere of production, and thus productive capital, has primacy over the others, as surplus value is extracted under its then surplus value is redistributed between productive money and commercial capital. In the total circuit of capital, money plays a crucial role, but it is also the most mobile element of the circuit. A crucial role because in the end, the capitalist economy is a monetized economy. But money, for this reason, money matters. But money has specific characteristics. When money represents value, that is, it does not become capital, it is very fluid. When it enters the production sphere, it has less fluidity. It is being tied down to specific commodities and specific productive activities. When money becomes payment for commodities, that is, it is a receipt, then it regains fluidity. Now, there exist tensions between money's inherent mobility and its necessary bound in production, in the production process. Why? Because this gearing of money to the production process takes time and it is risky. Also because each capitalist sees himself as a free rider. And third, that depending on the phase of the economic cycle, the tendency to fluidity can increase or can weaken. In order to grasp all these complexities, Marx distinguishes carefully between money capital's functions and especially between its function, the function of money as credit and the function of money as capital. And this is the cornerstone of Marxist monetary analysis, the Marxist political economy of finance. A capitalist financial system collects idle funds and channels them to investment through banking, that is credit, and through capital markets. These two branches operate, of course, differently, but the purpose is the same, to provide idle funds for investment. Now, money involved in lending and borrowing for Marx always is termed loanable money capital. And loanable money capital is subdivided into the generic forms: money dealing capital, which is credit in general for buying and selling in the sphere of circulation, for buying and selling commodities. And the second case is the second generic form is interest-bearing capital. Now, this is credit that is being advanced in order to make investment, to make production, and thus appropriate surplus value. So credit is used in circulation, but credit is predominantly used for investment in production. In the second case, the second form is interest-bearing capital. Now, credit markets involve both money dealing capital and interest-bearing capital. Whereas capital markets, that is stock exchange, involve solely interest-bearing capital. Now, the novelty of recent hybrid forms of financial assets, and especially of shadow banking, is that they combine in complex ways the operation of both banking and capital markets. Hence, they combine money dealing capital with interest-bearing capital. And this is indeed a contemporary novelty. However, it is a novelty that the classical Marxist uh, theory of value and finance can explain very pertinently. How? Let us say. The credit system begins with trade credit. That was its generic act in capitalism. Then from trade credit came banking credit, which arises in the discounting of trade bills and is based on the collection of idle money from several sources, and thus overcome some of the particularities of trade credit. By collecting idle money from several resources in the economy, banks particularly homogenize credit and begin to give it a less individual character than that of trade credit. The next development is the money market. In the money market, loanable money capital is traded among banks. And on the top of the credit system is the central bank, the leading bank of the money market. The capital market cooperates with the credit system, with the banking branch, but contrary to the latter, it mobilizes idle money on the basis of property, equity, rather than credit, that is, debt. Nevertheless, the credit market is connected with the stock market as both uh, uh, receive funds from the same pool of loan money capital, and as lending by the former sustains the operations of the latter. Now, because interest-bearing capital is money capital traded as a commodity, commanding interest, it has a dual character. First, it is immediately related to the sphere of real accumulation for interest payment. And second, it is immediately related to the form of credit money. Hence, it has certain degrees of freedom towards the sphere of real accumulation, as the interest rate which determines interest-bearing capital is formed outside the total circuit of capital by the supply and demand for loan money capital. This gives to interest-bearing capital a second duality. First, because it is a relationship between a capitalist possessing money to capitalist, and a capitalist possessing an investment project, functioning capitalist, it can give rise to speculation. Second, interest-bearing capital comes out of the generation of sums of money in the turnover of total capital, which are transformed subsequently into loan money capital by the credit system. So interest-bearing capital differs from productive capital because its owner, through lending, claims part of the surplus value in the form of interest without any direct involvement in production. In cases of unwelcome developments, interest-bearing capital's lender withdraws it and invests in other sectors instead of having to intervene directly in the industry. This characteristic of interest-bearing capital is crucial for money capital in the form of banks because it enhances the liquidity of their liabilities. Their deposits, which for commercial banks at least form the basis for their money dealing operations, are highly liquid since depositors are not tied to any particular bank. However, interest-bearing capital's freedom has limits because by lending directly to industry cannot be totally indifferent to the latter's outcomes. Now, fictitious capital is a form of interest-bearing capital. However, This obligation to repay a loan, which takes the form of debt, is possible to acquire a life of its own by taking the form of securities, examples, shares or bonds, and autonomously be bought and sold at some money value, which might or might not correspond to the ability of each sum of money to realize enough surplus value. This autonomous circulation of interest-bearing capital in the form of securities is called by Marx fictitious capital. Fictitious capital does not imply that it does not exist or that it is artificially created, as many commentators misunderstand it. They particularly confuse fictitious with virtual. Fictitious denotes that its circulation is distinct from the circulation or the yield of capital which it represents. Practically, fictitious capital represents an uncertain bet on surplus value extraction, surplus value that might be extracted in the future, but which it is being discounted in the present. Now, bet might succeed, might not. So, fictitious capital operation is closely related to the expansion of joint stock companies and the negotiation of their assets in the stock exchange, and of course, the expansion of credit money that facilitates to a great extent their transactions and their valuations. During periods of economic euphoria, usually high expectations are being fomented about the future, and these engineer waves of robust economic growth as these high expectations influence positive investment. These expectations-led booms have usually the tendency to overshoot, that is, to create increasingly over-optimistic future expectations. But as soon as the real economy cannot keep pace with these expectations, meaning that investment does not lead to the expected profits, then its growth starts faltering. In other words, the so-called fundamentals recall to reality the unsustainable growth engineered by fictitious capital. The busts that follow have also the tendency to overshoot, but this time to the downside. They usually lead to the eruption of economic crisis because of the burst of the so-called bubble. This role has been recognized long ago by several Marxist economists. For example, Henry Grossman, in his seminal work in 1929, showed that the fact that a progressively larger part of capital takes the form of share capital counteracts the falling profitability tendency. But this counteracting has limits. Also, Ito, in a very interesting work in 1988, embedded this function of fictitious capital within the phases of economic cycles. Towards the upswing trend and in the beginning of overaccumulation, the profit rate declines and commodity prices tend to rise. Then speculative trading and stockpiling of commodities take place in expectation of further price rises. Speculative trading also appears in the stock exchange as the share price of some industries begin to rise in response to the increase in the commodity prices. So, summarizing, classical Marxism as a coherent and sophisticated framework to grasp the phenomenon of prolonged financial euphoria without separating it from real accumulation. And this framework can also explain satisfactorily the recent financial innovations. Let us move to this to nowadays, the contemporary financial novelties. The most dramatic contemporary change is that the bill of exchanges are substituted as the dominant financial asset by the repo. So the bill of exchange, which has direct links to the financing of production and trade, is substituted by the repo, which is a sell and repurchase agreement. In a repo, a borrower of cash sells a bundle of securities for an amount of money to a lender with the agreement that the former will repurchase the securities for another amount of money after a fixed period. The securities thereby act as collateral for a cash loan. In the event that the cash borrower defaults on repayment, the cash lender owns the security to keep, sell, or use again as collateral. In this context, institutional developments lend to the notion of bank to become elastic, and the phenomenon of shadow banking emerged. This new trend tends to merge the two pillars of the financial system, that is credit and capital markets. It merges them mainly through securitization. Securitization transforms property into tradable financial assets against the promise for a future repayment, that is, into fictitious capital. In this way, the contemporary financial system becomes more unstable as traditional institutional mechanisms become disturbed. This contemporary financial house of cards depends upon the extraction of surplus value in the sphere of production. In historical terms, in the aftermath of the 1973 profitability crisis, the subsequent waves of capitalist restructuring failed to resolve the overaccumulation crisis. Despite the dramatic increase of labor exploitation, capital shied away from a decisive destruction of unviable capitals. Thus, profitability never recovered sufficiently. The last trick, together with the so-called globalization, was the expansion of fictitious capital. The expansion of fictitious capital acted as a counter-tendency to the falling rate, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Nevertheless, as argued before, this stratagem has definite limits. Expansion through financial doping soon met its limits set by real accumulation. Thus, the 2008 crisis erupted, and the financial collapse was geared to the problems, the real accumulation, and especially the low profitability. The other pillar of the Marxist financialization currents, namely that finance acquires an independent from surplus value mechanism of direct exploitation through usury, is easily analytically disproved. The financial revenues from loans given to workers can be an additional appropriation of a part of the value of labor power, or be a part of the value of their labor power that has been expended for the acquisition of socially necessary commodities. In the first case, if this appropriation becomes permanent, then it will lead to a new lower value of labor power. In the second case, the current value of labor power is actually lower than what it appears. In both cases, there are no extra and, moreover, no independent surplus value financial profits. To argue otherwise means that these Marxist financialization characters have a different theory of the determination of labor power and of the operation of the labor market than that of Marxism. In such a different from classical Marxism's theory, direct power relations instead of indirect economic mechanisms are the only mechanisms that can offer to the financial system extra profits. Again, this view misinterprets capitalism as a pre-capitalist system. It makes capitalism a system based on violence and violent extraction, expropriation, rather than on indirect exploitation through the extraction of surplus value. To conclude, the Marxist and Marxism financialization hypothesis currents, with the notable exception of fines, rather peculiar interpretation, are on 5 counts. First, they interpret short-run and conjunctural phenomena as long-run structural changes. In methodological terms, the financialization hypothesis is a middle-range theory and has all the problems associated with this type of theorizing. Second, they promote the false perception that the post-1990s financial expansion was a totally new phenomenon without any previous historical precedent. This is empirically wrong. Third, their argument about the financial system's novel direct exploitation mechanism equates unwarrantedly capitalism with a pre-capitalist era of transition from feudalism to capitalism. Fourth, they propose an unrealistic class analysis close the Keynesian and post-Keynesian views. If they lead to unjustified analytical fuzziness as they obscure the understanding of capitalism's fundamental economic and social processes. In a nutshell, in my opinion, the financialization hypothesis grandiose proposition about a new stage of capitalism or a new era of capitalism or a new brand of capitalism fails to account both analytically and empirically for the evolution of contemporary capitalism. On the contrary, classical Marxism offers a superior analytical and empirical perspective. Thank you for your attention.